Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Shashwati Shah, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Sikkim University. Today we will be talking about readings new literature in English, and the name of the module is Border, Region, Nation, Imagine Geographies in New Writings in English. The content of the module has been written by Mr. Rindon Kundu, who is a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. In this module, we will take an etymological journey of the terms like border, region, nation and new literature, and we will try to understand them vis-a-vis the context of the emerging new literatures in English. We will also try to understand how the concept of bodies at the border and anthropology of border relate to this concept of new literature. Let us begin. The word border comes from the old French word bordure, which around the 14th century does mean seam, edge of a shield or border. The geopolitical sense into the term was first attested around 1530s, coming from the borders, name of the district adjoining the boundary between England and Scotland. The term nation comes from the old French word nation, N-A-C-I-O-N, nation, which around the 12th century refers to birth, rank, descendants, relatives, country, homeland. The term came directly from the Latin word nationem, nominative natio, which means birth, origin, breed, stock, kind, species, race or people, tribe, literally that which has been born. The word region refers to the tract of land of a considerable but indefinite extent, which comes from the Anglo-French word region, Old French word region that refers to land, region, province around the 12th century, which derives from the Latin word regionem, which means a district, portion of a country, territory, a direction, line, boundary line or limit. The term New English Literature refers to the Anglophone literature of Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Oceania and Canada. The field has direct overlaps with English studies, for instance by including Black and Asian British literature as well as travel writings via Canadian literature. It is also closely linked to the field of North American studies with a special focus in the Augsburg New English Literature. The label of new literatures include the literary productions of a geographically and culturally vast and non-contiguous area that includes the former British colonies. For example, from Canada to Australia, from Singapore to Pakistan and India. In contemporary cultural theory, the metaphor of the bodies at the border has become a repository in which all manners of cultural otherness are contained. The assumption is that border thinking posits a contestatory space for emerging cultures. It shapes the concepts of national and cultural authenticity and promotes global and transnational processes. The borderlands metaphor resonates even more at the end of the century when borders are continually crossed and recrossed. Cultural criticism on the borderlands has created a discursive practice which arises from the meeting of the so-called first world with the geographic other, the third world. This type of project in which a critical field is marked out through a geographic region is similar to the practice of Orientalism critically reviewed by Edward Said. Just as Said reads Orientalist works through the imagined geographies that the works construct, so too can the borderlands be subjected to a topographical reading. In South Asia, the Radcliffe line problematizes the whole cultural, political, social, linguistical and geographical scenario, as India, Pakistan and Bangladesh were parts of the Indian subcontinent. So how a country which was vast enough with so many different provinces suddenly becomes two or more countries. So how this culture, political and social factors get all of a sudden changed and has to be reshaped, reworked upon. This is a tension that happens in the borderland regions because borders are formed, reformed and often also crossed from time to time. The partition and border war not only create terms like Saranarthi, Mujahir, Udbashtu, but also partition literature like that of Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, Atiyah Hussein's Sunlight on a Broken Column, Rahi Masoom Raza's Adha Gaon, Bhisham Shahani's Tamas, Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines, Bapsi Sidhwa's Ice Candy Man, short stories of Sadat Hasan Manto, Alok Bhalla and the poems of Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Borders in America also create frontier literature. For example, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, Catherine Maria Sedgwick's Hope Leslie, Lydia Maria Child's Hobomok and Anne Sophia Stephen's Maleska, the Indian wife of a white hunter. So we have introduced terms like Saranarthi, Mujahir, Udbashtu. These are the terms that are used to denote the refugees, ones who are compelled or forced to move out of their own homeland and find a new place elsewhere. So suddenly the place that they called their home is no more their home. So they are hosted in another country, they become a guest to another country all of a sudden, losing their own home, and therefore they are Saranarthi, the ones who want a place to stay, wants shelter. And they are Udbastu, Udbastu as in who doesn't have a home, who doesn't have the roots and have been uprooted from a place forcibly. So these are the people who lost their home and have suddenly attained the status of the refugees because borders were created all of a sudden. The nature of political struggle in Latin America, from tribal past and Spanish conquest to today's borderless free trade and economic imperialism, frontiers and limits at the center of Latin American identity makes literary art so dynamic. Borders are explored intelligently through forms. Juan Rulfo's Pedro Paramo, which was published in the year 1955, constructed an ample border zone between the world of the living and the dead, makes the reader of the novel enter into a totally magic world in which rational laws and rules collapse. In 1960s Colombia, the magic realism of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's literature challenged intellectual and metaphysical boundaries of logic. Novels such as Cien Años de Soledad asserted that this border zone is still politically active, and Gabriel full of complex waves that transcend bodies beyond the border. Borders does not mean only geographical border. It reminds us also of no man's land, globalization, border in the self, etc. The concept of bodies at the border makes us understand the border theory and border issues such as cross-border movements of people and products, the role of United States-Mexico borders, the United States-Canada borders in the international economy, the role of United States-Mexico border, the role of the United States-Canada border, and many such borders that are there in the entire world like India, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and many such. Their role in the international economy, the role of borders in foreign policy, regional planning, comparative administration, structures, and the construction of frontier literature. Border studies theory began when post-colonial and cultural studies theorists explored the complex political and cultural exchanges occurring along the United States and Mexican border. This theory has grown to encompass the dialogue and cultural exchange among groups of people from different ethnic, racial, and cultural backgrounds. Border studies theory further develops what multicultural theorist James Banks refers to as multiple acculturation, the incorporation of different heritages into the identity development process. While conventional multicultural theory tends to emphasize individual cultures, border studies examines the intersection of cultures and the resulting effects. This borderland can be viewed as a new territory for exploration, or what Root calls a significant frontier. From border studies theory arises the term border crossings, coined by Anzaldúa, which refers to moving across diverse borders such as race, gender, or geography. Maria Root offers four possible ways of thinking about border crossing. First, individuals can breach borders by having both feet in two groups or cultures simultaneously. According to Root, the former concept of straddling two worlds in 1 foot in, 1 foot out metaphor fractionalizes the multiracial person's existence. By having both feet in two groups, the person can be wholly immersed, respected, and accepted by two cultures simultaneously. Second, Root says the individual can shift foreground and background identities to cross borders defined by race and ethnicity. At various times, a person with a bicultural or multicultural identity or background may wish temporarily to emphasize or highlight one background while de-emphasizing another in what Root calls situational ethnicity and situational race. Root describes the situation, for instance, living in a particular environment, as sometimes influencing or creating a temporary emphasis of one's culture over another. Third, Root discusses the individual who decisively sits on a border, experiencing it as the central reference point. So these individuals, they don't want to cross the border but sit on the border so as to understand the issues arising from it. Just as Root describes the border between Mexico and the United States as a third country, she says that some individuals self-designate themselves in the other multiracial category not defined by the typical 5-race listing on many forms. These individuals wish to invent a new or revised identity. Root designates a fourth area as camping in one cultural group for an extended period of time and making forays into other camps from time to time. She states that this instance is not one of changing loyalties, but merely of adapting to one's own personal needs, saying that people might change ways of identifying themselves over their lifetime. Let's come to the concept of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is an attractive theory as it takes the individual human being as the basic unit. It seems to be the ultimate point of view if one takes equality among people seriously. At the same time, this ultimate equality is the origin of its most common criticism. According to nationalists, cosmopolitanism rules out the moral significance of particular ties and obligations. The global egalitarian aspirations of cosmopolitanism leaves no space for nationalist and patriotic ideals. It cannot take seriously the special relations we have with our fellow countrymen without reducing these nationalist or patriotic concerns to instrumental relations. They only recognize the special ties as an efficient strategy, not as intrinsically valuable. Tan claims this contradiction between cosmopolitanism on the one hand and nationalism and patriotism on the other to be a false one based on unproven assumptions about both theories. He wants to provide a better way of understanding the cosmopolitan position by clarifying the boundaries of the demands of cosmopolitanism, nationalism, and patriotism. Coming to the idea of the nation, it is a common misperception that the term nation and state refers to the same entity. Such misperceptions are spread by formalized. For example, the League of Nations was more accurately a League of States as it formalized relations between existing states and its data collected was mostly that of state populations. Even in the United States Pledge of Allegiance, one refers to one nation under God instead of one state. However, the two terms are quite different and we should keep that in mind. While a state, as previously stated, refers to a differentiated centralized organization with a monopoly over the use of force within a contiguous territory, a nation refers more to the composition of people living in a territory. A nation is more fluid. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a nation to be a large aggregate of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular country or territory. While having a contiguous territory is necessary of all states and common among nations, it is important to note here that nations can exist independent of borders. This is because people are mobile. In our current age of globalization and technological innovation, it is very possible for nations to extend not only across countries but also across continents, like the Jewish nation extending far beyond Israel and into the United States, an ocean away. The foreign fighter phenomena, where nationals return to their home nations, often a state to which they have never been before, to fight for their homeland, is another powerful example of the power of nations across state borders. The existing theory of the nation state. A nation state is therefore a contiguous territory wherein the entirety of the state's population belongs to a nation. Many have theorized to describe the creation of nation states. France, one of the classic examples of nation state, has an interesting story of its creation. In Peasants into Frenchmen, Eugene Weber describes the creation of a unified French nation. To Weber, the people of France weren't truly French until 1914. That is, they weren't truly Frenchmen until the First World War. Before that, the area that we now call France was as recently as 1931 a country of savages. Their lands lay uncultivated and were difficult to navigate without modern roads and transportation. There, the country people, peasants, known as peasants in English, were destitute, superstitious, poor, and suspicious of anything urban. People in France in 1931 were often illiterate, speaking one of many dialects of French that no Parisian could understand. To Weber, the creation of a national French identity came not from the French Revolution but from the modernization along three distinct state initiatives. First, according to his theory, the building of centralized roads and trains connecting directly to Paris facilitated movement of people and trade from formerly separated towns and economies from one another, and also helped to solidify a national French identity So the effect of nationalism can only be achieved when there is a connectivity among the places of that particular country. When people can communicate, people can establish alliance, that can be trade relationship. When people are freely moving and they understand people of other places of that very country to which they have never been to as their own people. There could be no national unity before there was national circulation. Second, mandatory conscription into military service, which also helped to solidify the national French identity by forcing peasants to move out of their hamlets to urban centers and around France, and by necessarily forcing soldiers to speak French to one another rather than patois. So you see, another important feature that helps in forming the idea of the nation is, of course, language. This is what is being described here. The third of this nation building policies was the introduction and centralization of public schools and a centralization of their curricula. The increased circulation, increased interaction and increased communication between the people of France made the French. Others have theorized about the means of nation creation. In Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson cites modernization as a creator of national identity. To Anderson, a nation is a community constructed by those who believe they believe to belong. The spread of print media, and in particular media in vernacular, helped stimulate the creation of nations in the modern age. After a brief sketch of the colonial period, the analysis will cover the fraught and intense border processes that accompanied the state and nation building period in the region. It then discusses the transition from a militaristic geopolitical conception of borders as the potential cause or objective of war to what is now an ongoing process of regional integration in the Mercosur bloc. A sub-regional bloc members are Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay and Venezuela. According to some scholars, we are living in a world where state borders are increasingly obsolete. The view holds that international borders are becoming so porous that they no longer fulfill their historical role as barriers to the movement of goods, ideas and people, and as markers of the extent and power of state. This is referring to the constant migration of people from one place to another. It's like the international borders are becoming more and more porous, allowing more people, ideas and literature, goods to travel. So they are not like solid markers that cut away cut off one country from the other. Withering away of the strength and importance of international border is linked to the predicated demise of the nation state as the preeminent political structure of modernity. The threatened passing of the state in turn heralds the weakening of most of the world's existing political, social and cultural structures is called into question, especially in terms of their loyalties and identities. In line with this fall-off in the determinative power of traditional political statuses is the rise of new politics of identity in which the definitions of citizenship, nation and state vie with the identities which have acquired a new political significance such as gender, sexuality, ethnicity and race among others for control of the popular and scholarly political imaginations of the contemporary world. Moreover, the processes are supposedly accelerating, continually shifting the ground upon which nation states once stood, changing the border, drawing lines, creating new geographies, restructuring older regions, creating new and important categories of transnationalism and increasing the significance and proliferation of images and a host of other messages about the relevance of other world cultures in everyday lives of us all. Coming to the concept of anthropology of borders. The growing interest of social scientists in the structures and function of international borders and the lives of border peoples and communities has increasingly demonstrated the dialectical relationship between borders and their states, relationships in which border regions have often critical impact on the formation of nations and states. These relationships are like many between the state and its regions, and they remain one of the most important and least understood in the general scholarship of nations and states, which too often takes a top-down view in which all power flows from the center. The anthropology of borders has a long but not very deep history, which began in many ways with Barth's paradigmatic ideas on ethnic borders, but which owes just as much to work that, although not specifically focused on culture, nation and state and international borders, nevertheless showed the value of localized studies for understanding how cultural landscapes are superimposed across social and political divides. Historical and ethnological studies also helped to develop this interest, though it was only in the 1970s as anthropologists began to address issues of nationalism, political economy, class migration, and the political disintegration of the nations and states that a distinctive body of anthropological work on international borders emerged. So, in this module we have discussed the ideas of nation, imagined communities, region, state, and how they are being formed and reformed by the formation of borders. Here we have spoken about the idea of nation, which is formed by the kind of cultural communication that people of the particular country have with one another. We have also spoken about the ideas of bodies at the border, and we have also spoken about how border does not only mean geographical border. We have talked about people who love to sit at the border and address the issues from there. We also talked about the anthropological aspect of border. I hope you have enjoyed the module. Thank you.